I want to begin, as I always do, by recognizing that the land from which I am speaking today is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, and the land and waters of what is now known as Ottawa. And since this is a virtual event, I would also like to honor all of the Indigenous territories represented here. For me, land acknowledgements are so much more than a formality. They are an essential and concrete action we all must take towards reconciliation and understanding of our collective past, present, and future. Now that we've covered that, we can begin. Today, we want to share with you some new work we are beginning out of the Canadian Human Rights Commission around monitoring disability rights, and specifically the intersection of disability and housing rights. We want to share with you all that this is an area that we are looking at closely. We want to share with you what we have done so far to get things started. And we want to share what opportunities there are now and in the future for engagement in these efforts to shape the monitoring of this important area of disability rights. Let me begin with some background. The Canadian Human Rights Commission, which I'll be referring to as the Commission or the CHRC today, is Canada's national human rights institution. We are an independent human rights watchdog. In June 2019, the Commission became formally designated as the body responsible for monitoring Canada's implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Monitoring means that we will track how the convention is put into action in Canada. It also means that it is the Commission's job to identify gaps and problems that need to be fixed. We call this monitoring work the work of the National Monitoring Mechanism, or the NMM. En français, c'est le Mécanisme National de Surveillance, ou le MNS. Conforme aux principes rien sur nous sans nous, notre objectif est de créer un mécanisme de suivi durable. Nous voulons que ce travail soit significatif pour les personnes en situation de handicap et qu'il contribue à un réel changement à travers le pays. Most importantly, we need this work to be done in partnership with people with disabilities, their families, their caregivers, and those that advocate on their behalf. The first step of the monitoring work was to engage with people with disabilities in Canada. This helped us to listen and learn about their experiences and their points of view. This was done through a public engagement process in the second half of 2020, which included a survey and small online dialogue sessions. The purpose of the survey was to raise awareness about our new mandate and to seek input on how people wanted to be involved in the monitoring work, as well as to identify their top issues of concern. A temporary advisory body made up of disability advocates and people with lived experience was used to help us design and distribute the survey. The advisory body also helped us to establish 4 principles to guide our monitoring work: participation, accessibility, equality and non-discrimination, and intersectionality. We received nearly 3,000 responses to the online survey, and you can find a summary of the results on our website. A majority, 64% of survey participants identified as people living with a disability. The online survey showed that one of the top areas of concern for people with disabilities is housing. People shared their experiences of inaccessible and unaffordable housing. They also told us that the waiting lists for accessible public housing are very long, at times over 10 years, and that some landlords will not rent to people with disabilities, especially those who receive disability support and income assistance. Housing is intertwined with the other 2 priority areas that were identified: employment and poverty. Unfortunately, these findings are not surprising. La situation de logement au Canada a été décrite comme une crise humanitaire. Le Canada occupe déjà l'échelon le plus bas parmi les pays de G7 en termes d'unité de logement pour 1000 résidents. Le besoin de logement et l'itinérance sont reconnus comme des domaines clés pour la réduction de la pauvreté au Canada, où les progrès sont à la traîne, alors que la surchauffe du marché du logement et la pandémie ont exacerbé ces tendances. We also know that current available data doesn't tell us the whole story. In a 2017 report, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing observed that people with disabilities in Canada are disproportionately homeless, living in poverty, subject to drastically restricted housing choices, subject to housing discrimination, and likely to live in substandard housing. This is especially the case for Indigenous people with disabilities. Nous savons que le droit au logement est fondamental et que sans logement, l'accès aux autres droits est très difficile. Dans la Convention relative aux droits des personnes handicapées, le droit au logement est lié, entre autres, aux droits suivants. Article 28, niveau de vie adéquat et protection sociale, et article 19, autonomie de vie et inclusion dans la société. But we also know that people with disabilities experience discrimination in all areas of their life, including housing. The Canadian Human Rights Act, like other human rights laws in Canada, and the CRPD, prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities. However, disability continues to account for the largest share of human rights complaints filed every year across Canada. Because people with disabilities told us housing was a top concern, we have made it a priority in our monitoring action plan, which is also found on our website. We have begun to take action in a variety of ways, including by raising the housing concerns of people with disabilities in Canada with various UN treaty bodies. However, we know that more needs to be done. And we know that engagement with people with disabilities is key in tackling this area. The Canadian Human Rights Commission has the good fortune of also being home to the newly appointed federal housing advocate, who will introduce herself in a moment. Comme nous avons le mandat d'assurer le suivi de CDPH et qu'elle a pour le mandat de surveiller le droit au logement, nous avons décidé d'unir nos efforts et de commencer à créer un cadre de suivi commun. En travaillant ensemble, nous pouvons tirer parti des outils qui accompagnent nos mandats respectifs et prendre ensemble des mesures concrètes en partenariat avec les personnes en situation de handicap. A shared monitoring framework can explore both sets of rights of people with disabilities and the right to housing, as well as the various intersections between them. This will help us to draw together all aspects of housing policy in Canada and the rights of persons with disabilities using a human rights-based approach. We want this joint monitoring to encompass the relevant provisions of the CRPD and all 7 aspects or characteristics of the right to adequate housing. That includes that housing is secure, affordable, habitable, provides basic services, is in a suitable location, is accessible, and is culturally appropriate. This framework can serve as an accountability mechanism, not only for government, but also as a way to demonstrate a meaningful and tangible effort to translate the aspiration of human rights law into reality for the people of Canada. Et maintenant, je vais passer la parole à ma collègue, Marie-Josée Houle, qui vient d'être nommée la défenseure fédérale du logement. Marie-Josée,
Bonjour. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you here and have the opportunity to share information about my mandate as Canada's first ever federal housing advocate and speak about some of the work that has begun to address the systemic challenges at the intersection of housing and disability. Avant de commencer, je tiens à souligner que je m'adresse également à vous aujourd'hui depuis le territoire non cédé du peuple algonquin-anishinaabe, ce qui est très, très significatif pour moi. C'est un plaisir d'avoir l'occasion de présenter le modèle de responsabilité unique en son genre qui a été élaboré au Canada à la suite de plusieurs décennies de plaidoyer par des activistes du droit au logement. J'ai pris mes fonctions de défenseur fédéral du logement en février de cette année. Je comprends que les titulaires de droit ont de grandes attentes et qu'il est urgent d'apporter une réponse fondée sur les droits de la personne à la crise du logement que connaît le Canada. Je sais aussi que les difficultés auxquelles nous nous heurtons au Canada ne sont pas particulières à ce pays. Le sans-abrisme, l'abordabilité financière, les expulsions, les conditions de vie dangereuses ou insalubres et la discrimination en matière de logement existent partout dans le monde. Alors que j'entame mon mandat prénal, j'ai beaucoup à apprendre. Aujourd'hui, j'ai hâte d'écouter les panélistes, les participants, d'apprendre d'eux et d'en tirer des idées qui peuvent éclairer le travail que je ferai pour nuer et mobiliser les partenariats à l'intersection du droit au logement et du handicap. The National Housing Strategy Act was adopted by Parliament in 2019, and I was appointed as Canada's first ever federal housing advocate in February 2022. The passage of the Act was a watershed moment in Canada as it recognizes for the first time in Canadian legislation that housing is a fundamental human right. The Act also commits the government to furthering the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing as recognized in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I will briefly explain my mandate, but I also encourage you to watch the 2-minute video that was shared with the online description of this event. The Act establishes important human rights accountability mechanisms, including the National Housing Council, review panels to hold hearings on systemic housing issues, as well as my mandate as federal housing advocate. It is an accountability model that has been informed by international experience and focuses on addressing the systemic barriers facing disadvantaged groups rather than responding to individual cases. So it is important to underline that my position is independent of government, and my office is based in the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which reinforces my role as watchdog on actions of duty bearers and an advocate on behalf of rights holders. I will play an important role in amplifying the voices of people experiencing inadequate housing and homelessness and promoting and protecting their right to housing. The right to adequate housing means much more than providing 4 walls and a roof. It means creating the conditions where people can live in safety, in security, and most importantly, in dignity. So adequate housing must be secure, affordable, habitable, provide basic services, be located in a suitable place, be accessible, and be culturally appropriate. So to advance the right to housing, my specific duties include monitoring the progressive realization of the right to housing and progress in achieving the goals of Canada's National Housing Strategy, undertaking research and studies into systemic housing issues, receiving and analyzing submissions from the public and organizations on systemic housing issues, reviewing systemic housing issues or referring systemic issues for a hearing by a review panel established by the National Housing Council, and making recommendations to the minister. Empowered by these duties, my mandate is to drive systemic change to laws, policies, and programs. Le travail préparatoire effectué par mon équipe avant ma nomination et mes propres décennies d'expérience en matière de défense de logement m'ont montré l'importance de l'intersection du logement et du handicap pour mon mandat. Mes collègues du mécanisme de suivi national, le MSN, ont joliment décrit le projet que nous entreprenons ensemble. Je vous parlerai de certains travaux réalisés à ce jour. Les difficultés dramatiques auxquelles se heurtent les personnes handicapées en matière de logement et la création du mandat de surveillance de la défenseur en même temps que le nouveau MSN font de la collaboration à la création d'un cadre de surveillance mixte un choix absolument évident. Notre objectif est de pouvoir commencer à piloter la surveillance du droit au logement des personnes handicapées au cours du prochain exercice financier, c'est-à-dire en avril 2023. Our monitoring framework will include a modest number of indicators that will help us to measure the right to housing for people with disabilities, a description of where we can obtain the necessary data. For example, is the data available in the Census 2021 or the Canadian Housing Survey, admin data, or other resources? And we want to identify data gaps and proposals of how to fill them. And finally, we will develop guidance for duty bearers on how to report on their obligation to realize the right to adequate housing for people with disabilities. Cette façon de recueillir les données nécessitera la collaboration avec les personnes et les intervenants au moyen du cadre OPERA. Le cadre OPERA comprend la mesure des résultats, des états en matière de politique et l'allocation de ressources dans le cadre de l'évaluation des résultats d'un pays. La collecte des données non regroupées pour mesurer les résultats fondés sur les droits de la personne n'est pas facile. Il est difficile d'obtenir les données sur le sans-abrisme, les expulsions, l'institutionnalisation et les intersections entre le logement, le handicap et la pauvreté. L'année dernière, un conseiller en recherche nous a aidé à déterminer les démarches et principes de surveillance fondés sur les droits de la personne, ainsi que les outils de suivi nationaux et internationaux pertinents. Nos principes de surveillance s'appuient sur ceux qui ont déjà été élaborés par le MSN, à savoir la participation, l'accessibilité, l'égalité et la non-discrimination, ainsi que l'intersectionnalité. Sachant que tous les droits de la personne sont interdépendants et intimement liés, nous avons déterminé 4 principes supplémentaires dans l'élaboration de notre cadre de suivi commun. Les 4 principes de surveillance supplémentaires sont accès à la justice, reddition des comptes, dignité et autonomie, relations tangibles avec les peuples autochtones. Dans le cadre de mes fonctions de surveillance, j'estime nécessaire d'entendre les gens de tout le pays parler de leur vécu. Le 30 mai, j'ai mis en place un nouvel outil qui permet de recueillir les observations du public sur le logement, outil qui serait l'un des principaux permettant au public d'échanger avec moi dans le cadre de mon mandat et de raconter son vécu. Cet outil permettrait aux gens de parler de leur vécu et de déterminer les groupes qui subissent les formes les plus graves de l'inadéquation, du logement et du sans-abrisme. En plus d'y trouver des renseignements en ligne, les personnes qui souhaitent raconter leur vécu peuvent appeler un numéro de la Commission canadienne des droits de la personne pour obtenir de l'aide et télécharger un formulaire imprimable qu'ils peuvent ensuite envoyer par courriel ou par la poste. We are at the beginning of this journey to effectively monitor the right to adequate housing for people with disabilities. I look forward to learning from the panel and engaging with all of you as we move forward in developing our monitoring work with the NMM. So back to you, Tabatha.
Thank you very much, Marie-Josée. We understand that there are some challenges on the interpretation channel and that it's causing some audio issues for people. One way to resolve that, if you are able, will be to turn off your interpretation, although we understand that that is not a fantastic option for many on the call. But our tech people are working furiously to try and resolve the issue as we speak. All right. We'll move on to our panelists and hope for the best in terms of being able to hear and understand each other. First of all, merci Marie-Josée pour ce survol de votre mandat et le travail que nous commençons ensemble. Now let me turn it over to our expert panel so you can hear directly from those with experience of the intersection of disability rights and the right to housing, in particular, reflecting on some of the most concerning rights violations that have come up, homelessness and institutionalization. We are honored to have two fantastic panelists with us today. We have Ingrid Palmer, Director of Agency Partnerships and Learning at Up With Women, and we have Vicky Levack, a human rights activist. Ingrid is an award-winning speaker, a diversity and inclusion consultant, and the founder and CEO of Focus on Ability, a campaign designed to combat ableism, challenge bias, and promote universal belonging. Mrs. Palmer is also the Director of Agency Partnerships and Learning at Up With Women, as I said, and Up With Women is a national charity supporting marginalized women, non-binary, and gender diverse folks who have experienced homelessness to exit the cycle of poverty. As a partially sighted former foster kid, Ingrid uses her lived and living experiences to highlight traditionally unheard perspectives of disability, leadership, intersectionality, and Blackness. Her insights bring the interests of voices pushed to the margins back to the forefront to inform on shifting the paradigm towards an accessible, inclusive future. Ingrid serves as president of the Child Welfare Political Action Committee, co-chair of the Accessibility Exchange Project, and a community mentor with the Cheers program. Welcome, Ingrid.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And we have Vicky Levack. Victoria Levack is a 31-year-old disability and human rights activist who focuses on the right to housing in the community. She is a spokesperson for the Disability Rights Coalition of Nova Scotia, as well as the PADS Community Advocacy Network. She is a passionate public speaker and always strives to do what is best for her community. She recently had the opportunity to speak to the Nova Scotia provincial government to offer her thoughts on Bill 96, the new anti-discrimination and hate bill being developed for Nova Scotia. She also has some experience in front of the camera and has been involved in several documentary films. Her first fiction role in Spencer McKay's film Interabled will be premiering in July 2022, and we're all looking forward to that. For more information on her work or to book her for speaking engagements, she can be emailed at vickylevack@hotmail.com, and we'll put that in the chat for you. So Ingrid, let's start with you. Thank you so much for being with us today. Can you tell us a bit about yourself? And then when it comes to our joint monitoring work, we would really value your reflections on intersectionality, the current gaps in our systems, and how they affect women with disabilities. And of course, any thoughts you have on meaningful participation would be welcome as well. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. The promotion of decent work and ensuring accessible processes that support equitable housing, education, and the improved lifestyles for the most marginalized populations is what frames my current and future aspirations. My energies are inextricably tied to social justice pursuits, for I am unable to quell this insatiable yearning to see true equity realized. My desires are deeply rooted in my own experiences, and I am really loath to continue to witness every one of our existing systems continue unabated when they are simply agog with the clamor for transformation. When I left home with just the clothes on my back at 13 years old, I didn't know that I would be homeless for over 10 years. Yet I wasn't homeless in the traditional understanding of the word. I mean, I lived in several places that ended in the word home, like foster homes and group homes, but most of them held very little sense of belonging or ownership. As a teen in the child welfare system, I was diagnosed with two rare disorders: retinitis pigmentosa at age 14, which has led me to be slowly and consistently going blind my whole life, and polycystic ovary syndrome at age 16, that has resulted in the growth of a beard as a female. Now, being a Black girl with a disability and a gender non-conforming characteristic in foster care marked me as an outlier among outliers. That much intersectionality pushed me to the very scarcest regions of social precarity where adversity, inequity, and exclusion ruled every aspect of life. I struggled through a broken system and then had the additional trauma of aging out, under-resourced, but with a lifelong experience of how vulnerability, especially when attached to disability, attracts way more predators than humanitarians. And like thousands of foster kids who went before me and countless more that have since followed me, I was almost statistically inevitable. It was almost statistically inevitable that after being ejected into poverty, I would find myself no longer figuratively less a home, but truly homeless in every sense of the word. Child welfare is the largest pipeline into homelessness, and foster youth, and in particular, those with disabilities that have individualized barriers that make them even more susceptible to being homeless than their peers. Being without shelter is another type of violence. It's a violence of exposure in both mind and body for untethered youth that have no family, no home, no belonging. A year ago, I heard from a youth who has shared with me that she has spent the whole of the pandemic, she also has a disability, and she's also from CARE, that she has been isolated in a long-term seniors care home due to the fact that there is a severe lack of accessible and necessary support services and housing. This is an issue that is currently flying under the radar, but needs investigation. Constraining the lives of people with disabilities has been an accepted norm due to the diminished value that has been placed on our beings. There exists a perspective that we have some sort of natural acclimatization to hardship, precarity, and discomfort that then fuels an expectation that every condition of our lives be thus mirrored. This sentiment is likewise reflected in the lack of collective knowledge or even serious interest in our needs, our place in the greater community. Our lives are not planned for, nor are we reflected in any of the broader narratives of society, whether it be in employment, in housing, marriage, or parenthood. As a visually impaired mother of three, I am keenly aware of our lack of visibility. Pregnancy rates for women with disabilities is on par with those without disabilities, and yet these parents remain inadequately serviced, employed, and are most likely to live in poverty and substandard housing, especially if they are also racialized or gender diverse. Single parents with disabilities are increasingly at imminent risk of homelessness due to high levels of discrimination. This is a fact evidenced by Up With Women, my current employer. Up With Women is a national organization founded by Leah Germanis, a neurodivergent entrepreneur who experienced homelessness herself as a young person and vowed on her hospital bed to someday help others like herself. We support our clients, many with intersectionalities, including disabilities, to surmount employment inequities and be able to transition out of poverty. There is no concrete Canadian stats, but it is estimated that 45% of people experiencing homelessness have a disability, and women make up 25%. Older women often experience homelessness due to financial instability that's caused by relationship breakdown or spousal death, as well as declining mental health and physical health. One thing that we see at Up With Women, despite the unique differences in particular populations' experiences of homelessness and housing precarity, is that there are certain common considerations for all women, non-binary and gender diverse individuals, and those are trauma, violence, and poverty. The housing crisis is national, and intersectional challenges are unique and nuanced to each region and to each situation. So the issues facing a mom on wheels up north differ, but are no less valid than the barriers faced by gender diverse students with disabilities on the East Coast, or a newcomer hard of hearing senior in an urban setting. As a member of Right to Housing Toronto, a network of individuals and organizations that are focused on monitoring the city's commitment to a human rights-based approach to housing, I offer the following suggestions. Please ensure that your work is grounded in intersectional, gender-based, and trauma-informed lens. Child protection systems must ensure that transitions to independence, those processes includes dedicated housing or rental subsidies for those youth exiting care. Please realize that even among the disenfranchised, hierarchies exist. And please identify those at the most extreme margins and go to where they are and listen with your hearts. Pay attention to solutions that reflect the connection between housing and other systems, which I believe was mentioned. Security of tenure is more than shelter. It also symbolizes the foundation for grappling with the complexities that stem from social and systemic inequities, and provides the ability to heal and to reach for better. Equity must be baked into the criteria upon which permits are granted to developers. Excuse me. Governments need to drive institutional change while influencing mindset shifts so that institutions change how they conduct their business, how they design environments, how they consider what materials that they use, and how they envision the people that will live there and will be using the facilities. The vulnerable of society are not damaged, but are forced to exist within damaged systems, run by damaged perspectives, enforced with damaged standards, measured with damaged equipment. We are fine. It is time to include people with disabilities in our neighborhoods, because the right to housing is for everyone, and belonging needs to also belong to everyone as well. In every situation, norm has continued to grab the win, but this time I implore that the status quo be broken. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for that and for kicking off our panel today. I was furiously taking notes. You certainly have a way with a turn of phrase. I've written some of them down, you know, homelessness being the violence of exposure. That was really powerful. And your last point about people in vulnerable circumstances not being damaged, but living in damaged systems. I may borrow that from time to time, get the message out there. I love it. Yeah, that was fantastic. There's so much there to reflect on, and we will have some time for Q's and A's and reflections nearer to the end of the event. But perhaps before we do that, I'd like to give some time to our second panelist, to Vicky. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to hearing your story and why you advocate for the right to housing for people with disabilities. And so perhaps we can start there. Where are you currently living, and what is that? What's your story that brought you there? And what was that like during COVID?
I currently live in a they call it an LTC, but let's call it spade a spade. It's a nursing home. Most of the people I live with are decades older than me and have very different issues than what I have. A lot of them, how do I put this? There's no way to put this nicely, so I'm just gonna put it. These types of settings are made for people to die in, not for people to live. If you need palliative care, this is a good spot. If you are old and like, you know, just need extra help because you're getting older and sicker, this is the place for you. For somebody like myself who is young and healthy and, you know, cognitively, I am chronologically the same age as my brain, it's very lonely. I was forced to live here. I was not given a choice. And what I mean by that is, because nobody can just lock you up. But what I mean by that is, they said you could either live with your parents till they're dead and then move into a nursing home, or move into a nursing home now. So they're like, we gave you a choice. Because every time I say I wasn't given a choice, the government gets really mad. But that is not a choice, really. I lived in a small town. There were no jobs that were not manual labor, which obviously I am not suited for, both physically and personality wise. And I learned that I was here and that I wasn't the only one in this predicament. And I learned that there were hundreds of us across this province and then thousands of us across the country who were forced to make the decision to live in a nursing home. And I want to make it very clear, because this thing is about housing. But when we talk about people with disabilities and housing, what we really talk about is not bricks and mortar, but the services we require to stay alive. You could put me in like the most gorgeous apartment mansion I've ever seen in my life, but if no one's there to get me out of bed in the morning or to make sure I have food, I'm going to die. You know, so to me, and for many people with disabilities, yes, having a roof over your head is important, but it's also important to make sure that those other supports are in place in order to live successfully in the community. And even our own premier seems to think this is a bricks and mortar issue. I've explained to him, as many of my colleagues, many times, that this is not just a housing issue, it's a people helping people issue. And we need to remember that and not just go, okay, we'll give them a house in the community. Well, that's great, but that's the literal last thing I really need. What's more important is, will I have people there to help me care for my needs?
Thank you. It's a people helping people issue. I think that's a really important point for us all to remember. You know, and in my introduction, I described you as a human rights activist because I know that you've been fighting for your rights for a long time here. Can you tell us a bit about that experience, what it's been like, and perhaps tell us a bit about your case against the Nova Scotia government and where it's at?
Oh, I am actually not involved in that case. I am just the speaker for the organization who is.
Okay.
So I am, but it had nothing to do with me originally. It was about 3 people who had intellectual disabilities as well as physical disabilities. And they were forced, all 3 of them, to live in different institutions. One person in a locked psychiatric ward for a decade. After they were told they were medically sound and could be discharged, there was no housing supports in the community for them. So they spent a decade on a locked psychiatric ward, which of course is not going to do. Like, she went in there with mental health issues, and then having to stay there when one is well, is not going to do well for your mental health. Like, we all know what being locked in for months and months was like. Consider that for a decade, and the havoc that would wreak on your mental health. One man was told they said he was too disruptive because he yelled a lot and screamed, and it turned out it was because he had a bowel obstruction and his bowel was all twisted. That's why he was screaming, not because I like to scream, but generally people with behavioral issues are making those noises, not to be annoying, but because something is wrong and they're trying to communicate, hey human, something is wrong. People, just like anybody, you don't kick them a bus for no reason. There's a cause, and people need to remember that. And so that case was saying these people were in medical institutions where they had no medical reason to be, simply because the supports were not available in the community. So we went, the DRC, which is the group I help represent, went and put a court case against the Nova Scotia government. And at first we did not win. And then we appealed it. And we did win. And the government said, okay, we're not gonna try to overturn this. And then they took us to the Supreme Court of freaking Canada, and they basically threw it out. They said, we will not hear it. Good day. And so now they are seeking justification to continue this practice. So they're saying, yes, we know it's discriminatory, but we have to do it, and here's why. Instead of just going, wow, it's awful, we're really sorry, let's fix this. They say it, like I said, they're like, the premier said multiple times, we're in a housing crisis, I don't know what you want us to do. And again, and I hope Mr. Hughes didn't watch this, it is not it is not a bricks and mortar issue. If you just give, because most people who are on the wait list for disability sports, I'm guessing, live with some sort of sport already. So if you gave them the money they needed to finance those supports until you found a suitable place for them, it wouldn't be so bad. And during COVID, if I can go back to that, because I remember one of the questions was on the sheet you sent me was, what was it like during COVID? I would not wish it on my worst enemy. Like, literally, it was hell. It was hell. We were constantly understaffed. I wasn't even allowed to sit out in the backyard because they were worried someone would, quote, jump the fence and give me COVID. Which didn't make any sense. And yeah, I wouldn't wish it on anybody. It was completely dehumanizing. I felt like a corpse. You know, I was a living corpse for a year and a half. That is what it felt like. I wasn't allowed to see my friends. I mean, I was eventually, but only 20-minute supervised visits, where they would sit with me and someone would literally stare at us the whole time. It was like living in a prison because they wanted to make sure we didn't touch. And it was like, okay, when did I go to Alcatraz? But it wasn't right. And it wasn't right. It was horribly, disgustingly wrong. And if anything, the pandemic has taught us that these sort of settings are not good for people's health. Because most of the COVID deaths in Canada took place in nursing homes. So this is not safe. None of us are safe from disease. It is a hotbed for disease and mental anguish.
Those are such important reflections. I'm particularly struck by your last point about, you know, about COVID and the fact that this is where you've been forced to live because of the lack of available services and supports, and yet during the pandemic, perhaps the least safe place for you to be. Very, very powerful reflections.
Yeah.
I'm just going to pause here for a second and ask Marie-Josée whether you have any reflections that you'd like to offer on what we've heard first before I have a couple of follow-up questions for the panelists.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for sharing your stories with us. And Vicky, I've heard you speak a few times, and one of the things that you said that struck me when we're talking about hidden homelessness or getting proper data is that oftentimes people in situations similar to yours are just expected to stay with your parents, and they aren't on anyone's radar, and that stayed with me a lot. So when we do monitoring, the data portion is really important. And you talk about, you're institutionalized is basically it. And part of our framework really is about deinstitutionalizing housing for people, and that part about living with dignity and having successful tenancies. And for a lot of people, having those successful tenancies includes, like you said, not just bricks and mortar, not even having the bricks and mortar being accessible, tailored physically, but also having all of those wraparound supports for all of your needs and not just your physical needs. So thank you so much, both of you. Incredibly powerful messages you've been sharing with us. And I'm really happy you've been able to speak with us today.
Thank you.
That's
glad I could help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we're going to be moving to our question and answer in just a few moments. So if you would like to put your questions in the chat, we can start curating those while I ask the panelists one final question, or if this is not suitable for you, please feel free to use the raise hand function on Zoom, which is an icon you'll find at the bottom of your screen. My last question for our two panelists before we open it to questions from the floor is one of, what is it we're not talking about? Right now, we're talking about that intersection of disability rights and housing, but what are the things that we're missing in the conversation? And I'm curious what your reflections are on that issue. And maybe I'll start with Vicky.
Okay, at least for the Nova Scotia part, the province is not meeting with people with disabilities. They are meeting with service providers, which they're not going to know what you need. In order to know what people with disabilities need, you have to ask, people with disabilities, and everybody is different. So I don't like the fact that we as a community are being spoken for. They're like, we don't have to ask any actual disabled people. Don't worry, little girl, we'll just ask the service providers over there. They don't know me from a hole in the wall. So like, I don't want to be spoken for. I want to be spoken to. Also, this whole idea of the government thinking it's just a bricks and mortar issue when it's not. Not only for people with disabilities, which is what we're talking about here, but I work with a lot of people with mental health and addictions, which I consider addictions also a disability. So, yeah.
That's great, thank you. And Ingrid, did you have any reflection on what it is that we're not talking about that we should be talking about?
Well, I think to piggyback on what Vicky was saying, that it's very important, you have to speak directly to persons with disabilities, but even so, as I mentioned in my talk, is really reaching wide and far and recognizing whose voices that you are not hearing. Because as I said, there are hierarchies even within marginalized communities, and even within those communities, there are people who are more outspoken, who are listened to first, who are sought out, and then there are others whose voices are never heard, who are never reached out to. And I'm also concerned with hearing about how the previous consultations went. That is only going to meet the needs, and that's only going to cater to certain people as well. I would like for institutions, monitoring bodies to make the effort to go to people and not always expect that people are going to come to you, that you're just going to set up, a call or a consultation and people have to come to you and people have to provide information in one way. People need a variety of ways to communicate, to give their feedback, and people also need to be reached out to. And we have to remember that persons with disabilities are experiencing compounded and numerous forms of oppression and inequity that really weigh on you, and that really, really reinforce a sense of powerlessness and apathy. And so, certain people aren't going to come out. Certain people are going to have to be, you have to go to where they are. You have to go into their environments to speak to them and to listen to them. And that has to be actively pursued. I believe that there are a lot of voices that are not being heard, that are being missed. And those are the ones that are very intersectional, tend to be. And greater effort has to be made to reach out to those folks and to capture their unique and very nuanced experiences that are being missed and overlooked. And as I spoke about, also parents with disabilities are extremely overlooked. If you even Google it, you'll never get it. All you get is parents of, others with disabilities. It's very hard to find information and data. And yet, as I said, we're out there in great numbers. Pregnancy rates, as I said, for women with disabilities are on par as for those without, and they're being severely underserviced, under-resourced, not being tapped into. Their voices are not being heard or catered to. And so it's really, really important to really take a good look at who is not here. You know, who are the usual suspects, and how can we reach out to those folks and not just simply say, hey, we're holding this, come to us, you know, and have alternate forms. Vocal and written are not the only forms of recording feedback and gaining insight. We have to be more open to other ways of collecting data and people's stories.
Thank you for those reflections. And with that, we have about 15 minutes for some questions from the audience. I would ask that people be brief so that we are able to get to as many things as possible in the time that we have left. And I'll be mixing up, I do see a couple of hands, and I'll be mixing between the chat and the hands that are up. Rest assured, if we don't get a chance to get to all your questions, which I suspect we may not, you can always reach us, and I'll provide us with some contact information at the very end of the chat. At the very end of the session, please put your questions in the chat, and we definitely will get to all of them. If not today, then at another or in follow-up to today. So perhaps I'll start with a question for Marie-Josée in the chat from a little while ago. So what attention has the Federal Housing Advocates Office given to the different needs of persons with disabilities in accessing community-based options and addressing institutionalization?
We get asked in different contexts, you know, what it means to be well, you know, what it means to have a home. And you know, there is the human rights definition, and that does include, you know, the whole issue of supports, wraparound supports, you know, because if we can't speak about a place being safe or secure for anyone without, or even security of tenure without the success of the tenancy itself, and that, you know, that needs wraparound supports, whether it's, like I said, for physical needs, for other kinds of supportive needs as well. So it's not just the focus on the physical structure, the location. You know, there are all the definitions of what a human right are to adequate housing, you know, what that means. And so it certainly does include the wraparounds.
Thank you for that, Marie-Josée. It's such an interesting question, and your work will be so important moving forward. I'm going to take a question from the floor. So Roche Longuepay, please go ahead. And I remind everyone to be as brief as possible because we have a lot of questions.
Okay, I want to just first acknowledge the two speakers here today who've had very compelling stories, wonderful advocates. So I think the speakers were very well chosen. My concern here today is directly to you and to the CHRC. Leaving 15 minutes for engagement of a discussion of this subject and this subject we're talking about, I don't think is fair. I think it is got a bit of an overtone of discrimination, in the sense that Vicky was talking about the idea of engaging people with disabilities. And, you know, I think the speakers here as well, they are similar to us. I think they would have liked to have engaged us in some discussion. I think there should have been a more open dialogue, and yet the platform you presented today is restrictive. And it is, in some ways, the manner in which it's been done is dismissive as well, and has an overtone of paternalism. And that is actually a violation of the code. And so if we're talking about engaging people with disabilities, you need to engage us here in a better platform. And I don't think you did that here today. So I'm disappointed in that. I'm just, there's a lot of things I would have liked to have said today, or questions you would have asked, but I'm putting that out there because we are restricted now to 15 minutes. Okay, I'll ask for your response and the Commission's response on that.
Thank you. I certainly appreciate the observation, and you know, I will take that under advisement for a future event. You know, unfortunately, with the time constraints that we had today, we had only an hour and 15 minutes. And we wanted to give an opportunity for the panelists to tell their stories. But certainly for a future event, we'll definitely take that into account. And I do see in the chat and others agreeing with that sentiment. And so please be assured that we have heard what you are saying there. Perhaps I'll move along to another hand before I take another one from the chat. I believe the second one I saw was Nancy Hansen.
Hello, my name is Nancy Hansen. I'm the director of the Disability Studies program at the University of Manitoba, and I'm also a disabled person. I think we have to get beyond token consultation, and I believe I know this was not the intention, but this certainly appears to be a token consultation.
Yeah.
Also, I would really like to highlight that at present in this country, at the moment, disabled people are choosing death, medical assistance in dying, because
Yes.
they cannot access housing. And I think it's absolutely disgusting that this has not been dealt with in a meaningful way. So I think when one is faced in an untenable situation of being offered death as an answer to inaccessible housing, something needs to be done, seriously, because we're dying to find a place to live.
Yep.
And that's wrong. Thank you.
Yeah, can I speak to that for a minute? Because as somebody who works in the housing field and sees where MAID is going, especially now that they want to open it up to so-called mature minors. Speaking as somebody who has suffered with, and I know people don't like that word, but it can be truly suffering when you're in it with a mental illness, when you're in one of, I call them spells. So when I'm in one of my spells, it's pretty dark. And had this been an option for me when I turned 18, I would have taken it without any questions asked. So the fact that it's now legal for people, like you said, Nancy, to choose or to be offered or choose that because they can't see a viable alternative, this is disgusting and it does need to stop. And I don't know what I consider to be a systematic genocide, when are people going to be like, hey, let's not do genocide?
Thank you for that, Vicky. I think many on the call, if not everyone, shares your sentiments that before we can talk about people dying with dignity, then they have to be able to live with dignity. And I really appreciate your reflections on that. Ingrid, did you have any reflections you'd like to share on that issue?
I stand in solidarity with every comment that has come forth from the audience. Yeah, real talk.
Thanks, that's great. We did have a question in the chat about whether or not the CRPD is enforceable in Canada, and how, if so, how do we go about doing that? And I think that's a really great question about, of course it is enforceable in Canada. It's law in Canada, like any other law, and it's embedded in the laws that we have in Canada, discrimination against people with disabilities. But the question is how to hold governments to account. And I know that's something we struggle with. And I wonder if our panelists have any reflections on, what we do to make governments listen. Vicky, you talked about, an important case in Nova Scotia, but what do we do to make governments do what they are supposed to do?
Well, I think, and this is very, very, very sad, but in my experience, the only way to make my government, meaning Nova Scotia government, do something in regards to people with disabilities is to shame the ever-loving crap out of them and to praise them before the media and go, hey, look, they're being jerks. And basically say how ridiculous and evil they are. You may not be evil, but you are doing evil things. And like MAID, for example, as it stands right now, I consider to be evil. What they're doing is evil. So, and I don't like bullies. So, and I just, you have to show the world, shed light on these horrible atrocities, no matter what they are, whether they affect people with disabilities or not, because that's the only way things are going to change. If you don't bring it to light, if you don't talk about it, they're going to continue doing it because it's what they've done for decades, and it's easy to do what's already been done. It's difficult to change, and often when it comes to government, it costs a lot of money, and they don't want to do that. So you have to force them. I wish it wasn't that way, but it appears to be.
Thanks, Vicky. That's right. We have to force them to acknowledge what's going on. And sunlight is, there's that saying, sunlight being the best antiseptic for something. And I think that's so true.
Sorry,
Ingrid, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. I just really feel too, like within the disability community, that some of us are still working siloed, and that we really need to unify and work together and jointly. And it's still you know, that old divide and conquer, and the government, you know, especially when they're parceling out their grants and stuff, they use that in a way to put wedges between you know, different areas within the disability community. And we really need to work against that, to come together in solidarity across disabilities, across regions, and push together and unite, and to be working more, you know, as a force to ensure that no one is being left out, that there aren't only certain voices and certain folks, you know, up front claiming to speak for all of us. We all have voices, right? And we all need to be speaking, and we all need to be, you know, representing our nuanced experiences. And I think that, you know, the more that we can unify and work together in solidarity and push hard, that will force the government to make change. They're not going to do it on their own. They are set in their ways. The status quo has been built upon myths and legitimized lies about our value and our lives. And this will continue, you know, until we rise up in solidarity and force them to do that. They're not going to do that willingly or on our own. We do have to make them do that, but we need to come together and work as a unified front, and not have, you know, certain disabilities or folks, you know, more upfront than others. And that's when I talked about the hierarchies within our community, and there are. And so we really need to reach out to those that don't often get reached out to, and don't get to speak, and don't get, you know, their perspectives highlighted. We really need to work more unified together on that front. End of thought.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I think, you know, just given the time, that those are some great thoughts on which we can end our conversation today. My sincere apologies to those who we were unable to get to with your questions, but we will take note of them and can follow up on all the key points raised. We do remind you that there are a number of ways that you can get in touch with us, and our email address will be placed in the chat for you to get in touch with us if you would like follow up on questions. And of course, you know, I thank everyone for their feedback on the format of this event, and we are always open to feedback on how we can do better and more effectively engage in the discussion and a conversation. These mandates are very new to us, and this is, you know, just the beginning of a conversation that we hope will be ongoing, and we want to hear how people want to have that conversation. So that's very valuable feedback for us to get. I think I will just look to Marie-Josée, see if there are any final comments from you.
I want to say thank you so much, well, one, to our panelists, but and you have been amazing. I want to thank all of you for being here today and for having patience with us and for vocalizing, you know, how you're feeling about this format, about everything that you're experiencing, and we have to listen and we have to change. So as Tabatha said, you know, this is the beginning of the conversation. I feel really bad because I'm seeing all of these raised hands. I'm seeing a lot of excellent questions, and we're not done. So I myself, and I think on the behalf of the commission and my team at the Federal Housing Advocate Office, you know, we look forward to engaging with you in a better way, in a longer way, and in the very near future. So again, humbly, I thank you so much.
Yeah, can we do like another one of these in like a month? Because I think this is something that like everyone had said this has to do, and maybe just have an hour or two Zoom where all they do is ask questions. The whole thing.
I think that's a really great suggestion, and I'm seeing some comments in the chat about, you know, treating this as an introductory session, and I think that's exactly right. Is that this is the beginning of a conversation, and it's so inspiring and given us so much to think about. You know, let's continue the conversation and yeah. Final words from either of our panelists? We've gone a little over, but
I'm available for speeches. And I think it's very clear that if you're a not-for-profit, and like, because I work with a lot of not-for-profits that don't have any money. Okay, so if you are a not-for-profit, I do this for free. If you are a for-profit, I will take your money.
Excellent. Thank you, Vicky. And Ingrid, any final words to you?
Yeah, I just want to say that, yeah, I would love to see another segment where folks other folks' voices are being heard and have the opportunity to answer those questions and to express their thoughts. So I 100% support that.
Thank you, and I'm so glad to hear that because certainly your reflections today were such a valuable part of the conversation, and we really need that to continue and to hear more voices, including those who are here and those who are not here, who we were not able to reach. And with that, I thank you all for your time, for taking the time to be here today. For your interest in this discussion and for your continued work and passion for this topic and all that you do in your work and in your daily lives to be advocates for human rights. And I wish everyone a wonderful day.